Today we'll be exploring some unsolved mysteries. But one thing that isn't a mystery is why we humans love fragrances so much. They don't only make us feel great and smell great, but certain aromas can bring back the best memories from times gone by. Every time I smell pineapple, for example, I'm immediately transported back to my days in Taiwan. All that's to say, fragrances are powerful and intriguing beasts. Which is why I'm happy to introduce today's sponsor, Scentbird, the company that's reimagining everything about how we discover, shop for, and even experience fragrances. Scentbird lets you choose a new designer fragrance to try every month for just $17. With each fragrance, you'll get a 30-day supply in one of these well-made, travel-friendly vials, so you can try out fragrances before committing to a full bottle. First up, I chose the king of the men's fragrance world, Creed Aventus. This bad boy usually sets you back a few $100s for a full-size bottle, so Scentbird's an affordable and sensible way to enjoy these luxury brands. It's full of sophisticated, warming notes. Next, I got Unsolved Joga. Really fresh and floral, just a perfect after-shower scent that's bound to turn some heads. Finally, Raw Spirit Wildfire. It's a really seductive, exotic blend of jasmine petals, lang lang, cedarwood, Australian sandalwood, and musk. Just beautiful. Use my coupon code, LAZY, for 55% off at Scentbird. It's just a little over $7 for your first month. Available in the USA and Canada. Thank you Scentbird for the sponsor. Check out their links below. Cherished by millions around the globe, and still going strong to this day, Unsolved Mysteries is a TV show which explores all things cryptic and creepy. Since the show's first episode back in 1987, the various hosts have covered thousands of mysteries of every kind, from cold cases to unexplained paranormal phenomena. As time's passed, some of these mysteries have been solved, and some remain unanswered. Today, we'll be exploring some of the most unsettling stories covered by the show during its most classic era, including any details that have emerged since their segments aired. Beginning with this.
Tonight we have a case of the utmost urgency. Someone is murdering young women in the Midwest. The authorities need your help. Please, watch closely.
In the annals of true crime, some cases stand out as chilling reminders of the darkness that can lurk within society. One such case is that of the I-70 killer, named after the highway he terrorized. Over a 1-month period in the spring of '92, this elusive and mysterious individual took the lives of at least 6 store clerks in the Midwestern United States. And hauntingly, not only was he still active when Unsolved Mysteries were making their report about him, but it appears as if he went on to take even more lives after his episode aired. I-70's spree began on April 8th, 1992, when, at approximately 1:30 p.m, he walked into a footwear store in Indianapolis and mowed down the 26-year-old manager, Robin Fuldauer, in one of the back rooms. She had been working the quiet afternoon shift alone, and her body wasn't discovered until 3 p.m, by which point the perpetrator was long gone. He had stolen $100 from the register. But money wasn't what motivated this guy. And, as the investigators would soon come to learn, I-70 was what's known as a thrill killer. A twisted sicko who takes lives just for the fun of it. Only 3 days later, on April 11th, I-70 struck again, this time claiming the lives of 2 victims inside a bridal shop in Wichita. Patricia Majors, 32, and Patricia Smith, 23. The pair had stuck around past the store's usual closing time of 6 p.m, waiting for a customer to come and pick up an item. However, the next figure to walk through the doors wasn't the customer they were expecting. It was I-70. He forced them both into one of the back rooms, and, with the same semi-auto pistol he had used to end Robin's life, fired a shot into each of their temples. Before he could flee the scene, however, the actual customer with an appointment arrived to pick up his item, and inadvertently came face to face with the murderer. I-70 took aim at this gentleman and ordered him into the same back room. Knowing full well what would happen if he complied, the customer said, "I didn't see nothing, man. I don't know nothing that's going on here. I just want to go home." For reasons yet to be explained, I-70 let this witness walk away, even though he had seen his face. The customer was so shaken up by this encounter that he didn't call the authorities until over an hour later. He was able to describe the man that he had encountered though, and these eerie composites were drawn up. The suspect was in his 20s or 30s, stood between 5 feet 7 inches and 5 feet 9 inches tall, and weighed approximately 170 pounds. He had reddish or sandy coloured hair, a high forehead, and droopy or lazy eyelids. Despite having a clear description of the perp, the authorities were unable to catch him before he struck again on April 27th. This time, the victim was 40-year-old Michael McCown. Michael had his back turned when I-70 entered his mother's ceramic shop in Terre Haute, Indiana. It's believed the killer selected the store based on its name, Sylvia's Ceramics, and that Michael's mother was the intended target. Given that his past 3 victims were female, and he let a male witness walk free, it's suspected that, for whatever reason, he only wanted harm to come to women. Unfortunately for Michael, he wore his hair in a ponytail, and perhaps mistaking him for the store's female owner, I-70 fired a shot into the back of his head. The killer no doubt realized his mistake though, as he bent down to steal Michael's wallet before escaping unseen. Michael was the only target not to be led into a back room before being dispatched of. Given that each of these incidents occurred in a separate state, it appeared at first glance that these slayings weren't connected. That is, until you consider that they all took place just off Interstate 70. The perpetrator's MO was similar in each of these cases too, and crucially, ballistics linked the same weapon to each incident. It was crystal clear to investigators that they had a serial killer on their hands, one with a short cooling off period. May 3rd. Another day, another victim. This time, 24-year-old Nancy Kitzmiller. Nancy was working alone at the Boot Village footwear store in St. Charles, Missouri. She wasn't meant to be at the store that afternoon, but being the kind soul she was, she had agreed to fill in for a co-worker who wanted to take the day off. A lucky escape for the co-worker, but not for Nancy. She opened up the store at noon and was found dead at 2:30 p.m. with a hole in the back of her head. Nobody heard the shots, but a witness did see Nancy chatting with a customer who matched I-70's description mere minutes before her end. On May 7th, 37-year-old Sarah Blessing was working a solo shift at a boutique in the Woodson Village Shopping Center, Raytown, Missouri. At approximately 6:30 p.m., nearby shoppers and clerks heard loud pops ring out from inside her store. The owner of the adjacent video rental ran over to investigate and saw a shady man quickly exiting the boutique. When he went to check on Nancy inside, he found her lifeless body in one of the back rooms. As he ran to call for help, a grocery store clerk saw the shady figure sneak up an incline to an Interstate 70 access road before disappearing from view entirely. She and several other witnesses had noticed that same stranger acting weirdly moments before they heard the shots ring out from inside the boutique. Apparently, he had been walking around the parking lot in what appeared to be a trance-like state. They described him as clean-cut and well-dressed. It's strongly believed that as Unsolved Mysteries were filming these reconstructions for their segment on the I-70 killer, he continued to indulge in his twisted hobby, taking his rampage down to Texas. He's since been linked to the slayings of 2 women in 1993. 51-year-old Mary Ann Glasscock, who was cut down on September 25th in Fort Worth, and 22-year-old Amy Bess, who was slain in Arlington on November 1st. Both women's lives were ended inside their respective stores just off Interstate 35, both in the back rooms. Sadly for Amy, she wasn't even meant to be at work that day. She had agreed to come in on her day off and help out, a decision which, unfortunately, proved fatal. After receiving 2 rounds to the head, she still managed to crawl to the phone and call for help, though the operator on the other end of the line couldn't understand what she was trying to say. In January of 1994, just a few months before Unsolved Mysteries aired their episode on I-70, he was linked to one more incident. The attempted slaying of 35-year-old Vicky Webb. She was shot in the back of the head at the Alternatives gift shop in Houston. Amazingly, the round didn't penetrate her skull, and instead lodged between the second and third vertebrae at the bottom of her head. Vicky collapsed to the ground and played dead, hoping that the man would just leave the store. He did, but then returned again and placed the pistol against Vicky's forehead. He pulled the trigger. Unbelievably, his .22 jammed. The man let out an audible laugh and fled the scene before anyone could get a look at him. Lady Luck had truly smiled upon Vicky that day. The only reason she had survived was because of an anatomical quirk which she was completely unaware of: her abnormally large spinal column. She went on to make a full recovery, and given that she chatted with the perp for a short time before the incident, she was able to give a detailed description of his appearance. According to Vicky, he was gaunt and weathered looking, and walked bow-legged. When she was shown this composite of I-70, she immediately recognized him as the man who had tried to take her life. Unsolved Mysteries report on the I-70 killer first aired on May 4th, 1994, with Robert Stack appealing for information that might lead to his capture. This appeal, however, was ultimately unsuccessful, and to this day, this elusive figure's identity remains unknown. But even more chilling than the thought that he was never caught is the thought that he watched that very episode of Unsolved Mysteries and felt inspired to continue his reign of terror. In November 2001, more than 7 years since he had last struck, Terre Haute authorities announced that the I-70 killer was a possible suspect in the slaying of 31-year-old Billy Brossman. Billy had been working alone at his store when his life was cruelly snuffed out. Security footage showed a customer entering the store before producing a .22 and leading Billy into a back room. Could this man be the I-70 menace, caught on camera for the first and last time? This perp's modus operandi was identical to that of I-70's, and Billy's store was located just 7 blocks from where Michael McCown was slaughtered. It does seem unusual that I-70 would take a 7-year break, especially given that his attacks in the 90s had taken place in such quick succession. But then again, it also seems odd that he would just end his rampage so abruptly and never strike again. As stated by Detective Rich Plummer in the Unsolved Mysteries segment,
"It's important for the audience to know that a serial killer never stops. They may stop for a period of time, but they never stop completely, and they will always start up again."
Perhaps the fact that his previous victim Vicky had survived scared I-70 off for a time. Perhaps he thought that featuring on Unsolved Mysteries would draw too much unwanted attention. Perhaps he really did try to suppress his urge to kill, and in 2001, that urge grew too strong to ignore. Or perhaps his spree never truly ended, and he simply changed hunting grounds. As the years have turned into decades, the case has only grown colder and colder, but the memories of the I-70 Slayer's actions still live on. Today, 29 years after his segment aired on Unsolved Mysteries, and 31 years since he claimed his first victim, I-70 is still a wanted man. These age-progressed composites of the suspect were recently released to the public in an effort to finally bring him to justice. And, just last year, all of the agencies involved in the investigation sent pieces of evidence away for DNA testing using modern technology. As it stands right now though, this hasn't resulted in any breakthroughs. Christine Skubish was a 33-year-old mother who lived in Sacramento, California, with her 3-year-old son, Nick. For young Christine, the future looked bright. Not only had she just earned her paralegal certification and was about to begin a new and exciting career, but she was also getting ready to marry Nick's father in the coming months. At midnight on June 5th, 1994, both she and Nick embarked on a fateful journey along Highway 50 in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Their destination? Carson City, Nevada, roughly a 3-hour drive away. Christine had arranged to spend a few days there at a friend's house. Unfortunately, she never made it. On June 8th, Christine's stepfather, Dave, received a call from that very same friend. She explained that Christine and Nick were meant to arrive in Carson on Monday, but that it was now Wednesday, and nobody had heard from them. Dave phoned all of the hospitals within driving distance, but neither the mother nor the young son had been admitted to any of them. Presuming that they had crashed at some point along the highway, Dave reported Christine and Nick missing. If they were in need of rescue, it was imperative that they be found as soon as possible. If left to the elements, they wouldn't last long. The days in California were blisteringly hot that time of year, and the nights dark and cold. Despite patrolling the entirety of the highway Christine would have taken to reach Carson, deputies couldn't find her vehicle anywhere, nor any signs of a crash. It was as if Christine and Nick had fallen off the face of the earth. After 2 days of fruitless searching, the investigators received a tip from a woman named Deborah Hoyt. Deborah and her husband had been driving along Highway 50 late on Friday night when they saw something laying on the side of the road. The body of a dead woman. She was positioned on her side, facing towards the couple. Her long legs were slightly bent at the knees. One of her arms was resting underneath her head, the other on top of it. She appeared to be covered in blood, and, strangely, wasn't wearing any clothes whatsoever. Fearing that this was some kind of trap, and that other individuals were hiding in the bushes, waiting to hijack a Good Samaritan's vehicle, Deborah and her husband didn't stop to investigate, and instead continued until they reached a payphone. 2 police cruisers were immediately dispatched to where Deborah had seen the lifeless woman, a stretch of road called Bullion Bend, just outside of Pollock Pines. But to the officers' confusion, they found no woman, alive or dead, anywhere. When news of this report reached the Skubish family the next morning, they began suspecting that the body may have belonged to Christine. Her fiancé and parents urged detectives to investigate further, and Deputy Rich Strasser agreed to return to Highway 50 and conduct a more thorough search. With daylight now on his side, it didn't take him long to find an ominous clue by Highway Post 16. A child's black tennis shoe, resting on the road next to a steep 40-foot embankment. Realizing that this was a particularly treacherous turn, Strasser went with his gut and peered over the ledge. At the bottom of the steep ravine, hidden from sight, was Christine's wrecked vehicle. It had clearly flown off the road at a great speed and struck several trees on its descent. The entire top of the vehicle had been ripped off. Strasser rushed to the bottom and peered inside the car. Still buckled up in the driver's seat was the lifeless body of Christine Skubish. In the passenger seat, he saw Nick, curled up in the fetal position. He was motionless. His skin was blue, and he wasn't making any noise. Given that 5 days had passed, Deputy Strasser knew that the youngster was gone. He touched the boy's neck to confirm there was no pulse, and when he did, Nick took a breath. Remarkably, the boy was still alive. Severely dehydrated and suffering from hypothermia, yes, but alive nonetheless. Strasser called for assistance, and Nick was rushed to hospital. As doctors did their best to save Nick's life, investigators began piecing together how this whole situation arose. They theorized that at some point after 2 a.m. on June 6th, Christine fell asleep at the wheel and drove into the ravine. For the next 5 days, thousands of motorists passed by the wreckage, unaware of what lay just out of eyesight. As for Nick's shoe, that may have flown out the window as the car went over the ledge. Amazingly, Nick survived his ordeal. His doctors couldn't stress enough how lucky he had been, stating he would have only had an hour or two left to live had he not been rescued. If Deborah Hoyt hadn't seen the body by the roadside the night before, Nick would have surely perished. And yet, therein lies the unsolved part of this mystery. Who had Deborah seen? As stated, Christine's body was found fully clothed and still buckled up in her seatbelt, and the coroner determined that she had died on impact. To put it bluntly, there was absolutely no way she could have left the vehicle and made the steep ascent to the roadside. And yet, no other woman was discovered along the highway. As stated on Unsolved Mysteries, some believe that Christine's love for her son burned so brightly that it brought her back from the dead, that her spirit, or reanimated body, made its way up to the roadside to signal for help. Since then, others have come up with some more down-to-earth theories. Firstly, that this was nothing more than a bizarre prank, that the woman on the tarmac was messing with passing drivers, unaware that just out of view, another woman was dead, and her son was in mortal peril. Another theory is that Deborah Hoyt mistook roadkill or a piece of debris for a human in the road. But if that's the case, it's extremely coincidental that Christine and Nick were also in that specific area. Though there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that this was the case, some folks online have questioned whether Deborah and her husband had accidentally run Christine off the road. They wanted to summon rescue, of course, but didn't want to implicate themselves, and so waited 5 days before calling in with an elaborate story. In my mind though, the most logical explanation is that the phantom Deborah saw was actually Nick. Hot from the day's sun, he had removed his shirt and shorts and stumbled from the car in search of help. As he walked along the roadside, one of his shoes came off. He then returned to the vehicle, frightened and confused, seeking the comfort of his mother. However, Deborah and her husband remain adamant that the figure they saw in the road was a fully grown woman. It's also hard to believe that Nick, who was just 3, could make it to the top of the steep 40-foot incline. Whichever way you look at it, there are some elements to this mystery that just don't add up. Years after his episode aired on Unsolved Mysteries, and now in his early 30s, Nick Scoobish himself claims that immediately after the crash, he remembers seeing a bright light surround his mother's car. Though he's forgotten most of the days that he spent in the vehicle, he does remember the solitary nights very well. In particular, he recalls seeing the figure of a woman standing near the road each evening, watching over him. Question is, have these memories been conjured up by Nick's subconscious to deal with a harrowing experience? Or are they accurate? I'll leave that for you to decide. As a final point, Christine's aunt, Karen, also remembers a bizarre set of dreams that she had during the nights that her niece was missing. Dreams that began at 3 AM on June 6th, just after Christine and Nick disappeared. "That night, I had a dream," said Karen. "I was in Christine's house, and there was a terrible wind. Nicky was standing in the middle of the yard, and Christine was trying to get to him. All of a sudden, the winds increased to hurricane levels. I could hear the sound of glass breaking and popping, and metal scraping. When I opened the door, the wind stopped. I ran to Christine, and she was just standing there with Nicky. Nervously, I was laughing, and I turned her towards me and asked if she was all right. When I looked into her eyes, they were blank, and there was no life in them. She looked like she was in a trance, because she didn't look at me, but through me. I asked if she was okay, and she said, 'No.' I said, 'Are you going to be okay?' She looked at me with very haunting eyes and a melancholy expression, and again said, 'No.'" We'll end this with a segment of Unsolved Mysteries that's been burned into people's minds, not only because of the story itself, but because of the eerie imagery attached to it. December 20th, 1980. It was a bitterly cold winter's night in Minnesota, and 19-year-old Jean Hilliard was driving back to her family home in the small city of Lengby after a night out. But as she made her way along the narrow country roads, disaster struck. Her tires hit a patch of black ice, which sent her vehicle careening off the road and into a ditch, rendering it completely immobile. Stranded in the freezing cold, Jean knew that sitting in her broken car until morning was a death sentence. Rather than sit there and wait to expire, she decided to take her chances and set off in the direction of a friend's house, hoping that, against all odds, she'd either make it there or find help before hypothermia set in. Trouble was, it was a 2-mile journey. It was midnight in the middle of nowhere, and outside, it was minus 30 degrees Celsius. Jean trudged through the desolate, frozen countryside, barely able to see for the pitch blackness, heavy snow, and bone-chilling wind. Wearing only a jacket, jeans, and cowboy boots, every second spent outside felt like a million daggers piercing her skin. But she didn't truly begin to panic until she stopped feeling anything at all. As she drew closer to her friend's house, her entire body began to feel numb. Soon, it became a challenge to even think straight, and a strange desire to just lay down and go to sleep overtook her. After walking for close to an hour, an exhausted and disoriented Jean finally made it to her friend's home. Warmth and safety was just a few steps away, but journeying through the snowdrift had pushed Jean's body to breaking point, and just 15 meters from her friend's front door, she collapsed. For the next 6 hours, Jean lay unconscious in Arctic temperatures. At 7 a.m., her friend, Wally Nelson, found Jean's body in his driveway, encased in a shell of ice. She had turned into a human statue, frozen completely solid. When he lifted her up and placed her in his car, her limbs didn't dangle. "Her face was ghost-like, and her body was stiff as pulp stick," said Wally. "I figured she was dead." Wally rushed Jean to the hospital, even though there was clearly nothing anyone could do for her. Doctors tried to gauge Jean's body temperature, but it was so low that their thermometers struggled to register it. They tried to administer an IV drip, but her skin was too hard to pierce with a needle. Her mouth wouldn't open. Her arms wouldn't bend. Her eyes wouldn't respond to light. According to Dr. George Sather, Jean's body was like a frozen piece of meat. Unable to check her vitals, the doctors initially thought that Jean was dead. That is, until one of them noticed small bubbles coming out of her nose, and another heard a faint whimpering from her mouth. Unbelievably, Jean was still alive. Though her chances of survival were effectively zero, the hospital staff did everything in their power to thaw Jean out and save her life. They wrapped her in electric thermal blankets and attached heated pads to her icy skin, being careful not to raise her body temperature too quickly. After some time, they were able to detect a pulse. Her heartbeat had slowed to just 8 beats per minute, and she was taking a breath just 2 or 3 times per minute. But even though she was still alive, the prognosis was bleak. Even if she survived, and that was a pretty big if, she'd almost certainly have severe brain damage due to a lack of oxygen. Her limbs would also need amputating due to frostbite. All that's to say, not much of a life was waiting for her if she ever regained consciousness. Doctors continued thawing her out for the rest of the morning. As Jean's body slowly warmed, it regained its natural colour and flexibility. At noon, she awoke from her stasis and asked a nurse for a glass of water. Stunned doctors rushed in and asked how she was feeling. Jean responded that she was worried what her dad might say about the wrecked car. She had no idea she had just been brought back from the brink of death. Miraculously, Jean hadn't lost any brain function. Her mind was in perfect working order, and she remembered everything from the night before, right up to when she collapsed. Experts were sure that they'd have to amputate all of her limbs due to frostbite, but once again, defying all the odds, both of her arms and legs regained complete functionality after just 3 days of recovery. After 49 days of examination, she was released from hospital. Today, she continues leading a completely normal and healthy life. The medical community stood in awe, struggling to comprehend this remarkable feat of survival. Specialized equipment now exists to help people suffering from extreme hypothermia, sure, But back then, Xane had been taken to a small, rural hospital that lacked such technology. Indeed, that was the unsolved element of Xane's story that earned it a place on Unsolved Mysteries. As mentioned in the episode, some people put Xane's recovery down to the local community, who held a prayer chain for her as she thawed out. Though her case is still considered something of a medical mystery, most believe that there's a more scientific explanation. Experts now theorize that while out in the snow, Xane went into hibernation mode. Her body must have frozen before her heart stopped, and her brain had likely become so cold that its cells required very little oxygen to survive. The fact she didn't need any limbs removed was pure luck. Since her doctor knew to increase her blood flow at the same rate she warmed, Xane was able to make a full recovery. In the doctor's words, "No one's dead until they're warm and dead." Speaking of her near-death experience, all Xane had to say was, "It's like I fell asleep and woke up in the hospital. I didn't see the light or anything like that. It was kind of disappointing. So many people talk about that, and I didn't get anything." It's nice to end things on a positive note for a change. But even though we're finishing optimistically, I think we can still learn some sort of lesson from these tales. And while searching for a moral to end this video with, I've come up with this. Drive safe. A huge thank you to my top tier members on YouTube and Patreon: Alex Greensall, Asia Mina, Azrael Warakai, Brad Hammer 33, Chief Kochuake, Colin Monsma, Connor Lothan, Gina Valera, Hamish, Ian Biluck, Leonardo Martinez, Dustin and Tiffany Vanderpool, Monica Mendoza, Mrs. Yvonne RANKIN, Peter Lulgjuraj, Hamish K, Taylor&Monica Gruenke, TheOnlyDorita, TnSMOM, VerilyVerdan, Xane, GR, Ellen Doloff, Itai Alon, Nefus 1988, and Lydia Ciummo. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. The devil's in the detail.